Public opinion on Israel in the U.S. is cratering, as we've covered on this show. By some measures, over 80% of Democrats now hold an unfavorable view of Israel. A growing number of Republicans do as well. So the people who've spent decades building that U.S.-Israel relationship, they know what that means. That sentiment eventually shows up in Congress, threatening Israel's unconditional weapons supply from Washington. So they're moving now, while they still can, through quieter, more insidious measures that most people have not heard of. One of them is called Section 224, which is buried in the House's defense bill. It would have the Secretary of War designate an executive agent to fuse the U.S. and Israeli defense industrial sectors, integrating Israeli-developed technology directly into U.S. research, procurement, and manufacturing across everything from AI to biotech to missile defense. Experts are warning that this would be nearly impossible to undo. And there's something called Section 622. With similar aims, it's buried in the Senate's intelligence bill. Today, we're talking about all of that with Prem Thakker, political correspondent and columnist for Zeteo. Prem, welcome to Breakthrough News Live.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Well, it's so good to get you on the show, and you have been following these developments, so you're the perfect person to speak to about them. Let's start with Section 224, which is actually titled the U.S. Israel Defense Technology Cooperation Initiative, and like I mentioned, it's buried in the House's draft of next year's National Defense Authorization Act. So to give people an idea of how much the Israelis are pushing for this, I just also want to note that Netanyahu reportedly wrote a personal letter to a member of Congress thanking him for backing it. So Prem, walk us through what this actually does, who's pushing for it, and why people should care.
Yes, so your intro laid it out perfectly. Honestly, the Senate and the House versions are kind of parallel and tandem as the NDAA moves through Congress over the coming weeks, the Pentagon budget authorization legislation. And what's important to understand is, as you lay out, is that obviously public opinion in America is massively tanking towards the U.S.-Israel relationship. That includes, of course, the billions of dollars every year that the U.S. sends to Israel. And that's just, of course, the $3.8 billion that we know for sure. But as we've seen just in the past 3 years, that's involved many, many more supplements of aid and of weapons. And with that creating of public opinion, out came this idea that's kind of been in the works for years, which we'll get into, to formalize the U.S.-Israel relationship in other crafty, creative ways that goes beyond and kind of sidesteps this question of money to Israel. Essentially, what these amendments seek to do is formalize and deepen the relationship between the U.S. and Israeli militaries in such a way that is, as you say, almost irreversible. It is at once something that would deeply integrate the co-production of weapons, the sharing of data, integration of AI, cybersecurity and research processes, biotechnology, you name it, any sort of scary possible word that deals with the security state and our militaries would be integrated in a way that goes far beyond anything beforehand of just being allied nations. This would be something that the U.S. would have no probably similar analog to with regards to other allies. That's how deep this could go. The reason that is so important is not just because it'd be so deeply entrenched, but also because that also limits congressional oversight. Already we've seen there's limits to how much Congress can do or even has the will to do when it comes to just simply following the law and cutting even some aid or weapons to Israel as it's committing a genocide. One can only imagine how much harder it is to hold a foreign country accountable when it's essentially integrated with all of our processes.
Well, it's crazy. And also the fact that so many people are just not even aware of this, as you said, as public support for an arms embargo in Israel is more popular than ever. But, as you mentioned and Rania mentioned earlier, the companion piece to Section 224 is Section 622 in the Senate's intelligence bill introduced by Senator Tom Cotton. And this would lock in expanded intelligence sharing with Israel and make it nearly impossible for a future president to scale it back. unless they can point to what the bill calls a specific and identifiable national security concern. This is moving forward right as the Pentagon's own counterintelligence people are reportedly raising the threat level on Israeli spying against the U.S. What's the significance of this provision, and what do you make of that timing?
I mean, yes, these addendums that are added to these bills about exceptions of, oh, unless there's a security risk or unless the recipient of such aid is found to be breaking the law. It's window dressing. There's no actual mechanism to deploy to use that language to say, hey, this actually doesn't make sense, because that language invalidates the entire thing, as you're suggesting. That if one were serious about national security interests or about protecting the homeland, this relationship would make no sense, because the Israeli government, like other nations, but particularly the Israeli government, has done a great job of maintaining a spying apparatus over the U.S., particularly U.S. officials. We've seen how the Israeli government has exerted massive influence on the daily life of U.S. society just for the past 2.5 years in terms of how much free speech people have. And so it's almost silly that they even, especially senators like Tom Cotton, even bother to include that language, because we know they don't care about it. I would just want to point to the fact that, this development is not coming out of nowhere, that there is in fact some seeds that have led to this moment, that it wasn't spontaneous, that several Republicans and Benjamin Netanyahu all at once have advanced this vision to integrate the U.S. and Israeli militaries. There's a lot to say. I want to make sure I get to your questions before we dive into that, because there's a lot to get into with regards to where this is coming from.
Well, yeah, I do. I want to get to where it's coming from for sure. And there's particular forces behind it. But I do first want to ask you, I'm glad you allowed me to get to this, because a lot of this is also a result, yes, of there's forces pushing for it, but because of a shift in public opinion on Israel in the U.S., which has cratered since October 7th. And you've really been tracking that shift quite closely, as the Israel lobby has as well. So I guess, why does this moment matter? And how is that shift, that cratering of support for Israel, shaping the strategy behind something like Section 224? And it goes along with what you're talking about with the attack on free speech. It's really these really, really anti-democratic measures, because the U.S. is still like an ostensible democracy, right? So like, if people are getting to elect their representatives and more people hate Israel, that's a big problem if you're Israel or supportive of Israel, and you just like need that endless weapons flow to continue this project.
If you look at several different parts of this moment, you can understand why it is so urgent for pro-Israel Republicans, maybe some pro-Israel Democrats in the Israeli government, to codify this as soon as possible. For one, with regards to Netanyahu, obviously his political future is uncertain. He has an opposition that is mounting a campaign against him. He has his own charges that he has to deal with if he indeed loses. So this is existential for him personally, in terms of showing people, his constituency, that he can still get results. Those results, I guess, including unconditional support for whatever violence they want to do. With regards to pro-Israel politicians in this country, it was already clear in the past year, even I guess in some respects, because of the loss of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, or I should say Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, that the entire relationship is fundamentally different, and there's no going back with regards to how people in this country feel about Israel and the U.S. relationship to it. That is all the more aggravated in kind of this period where, on one hand, there's ostensible ceasefires in places like Gaza, where there's meant to be reconstruction being had. Obviously, that's not really the case. There's been 1,000 people in Palestine killed since the ceasefire, and in Gaza specifically, let alone all the violence in the West Bank. There's this sort of fledgling, unsuccessful, as we've seen, hopefully to be the case this week, war on Iran that will hopefully come to an end, that was also in some respects seen as this kind of desperate last throes of violence to try to, in terms of the Israeli government, advance its Greater Israel project. all to say there's all these different expressions of desperation, of just trying to grasp for whatever they can. And especially with the hopeful sundowning of this disastrous war, Israel is coming to see that there aren't that many levers left to pull. And so, if that is the case, and if sort of things are going back on the horizon, the final thing you can really do up to this point, especially given how many politicians are being elected on the premise of cutting the US Israel relationship, is to codify it as much as possible before they get elected. I mean, you see all of these elections all across the country, particularly Democratic ones, where over and over again, the one who is more critical of Israel, if not is winning, is completely shifting the entire conversation. In almost every single primary, it's almost unacceptable for a candidate to say that they believe the current US Israel relationship is acceptable. And so, because of that, they are very desperate in whatever way they can to deepen these ties, because soon enough, it is very possible that there could actually be some structural changes to this relationship that would have been unforeseen even in a year or two ago.
Yeah, I mean it's wild, and I think right now a lot of those pro-Israel hawks are sort of panicking, especially as this deal comes kind of to fruition. And I wanted to speak about the connection to the war in Iran and a lot of the same forces that are pushing for this provision, Section 224, have also played a major role in building the case for the war that is U.S. and Israel just fought against Iran. Specifically, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, an organization that, despite its name, does not do a whole lot of defending democracy. So can you walk us through their role in pushing for these measures?
Yes, and I would highly recommend. We have this great piece on our website at Zeteo from about a week and a half ago that really traces down each part of what I'm about to say. I think it's a good resource for your listeners, but also those who might want to share it with their friends or family. Yeah. I think it's a very, very helpful resource that touches on a lot of different aspects of foreign policy, both on the Republican and Democratic side, that you will find very useful. So the Foundations for Defense of Democracy, FDD, it was founded by this New York Times journalist turned Republican staffer in 2001, and it was known as Emet at the time, the Hebrew word for truth. And the purpose originally at the time was to provide education to enhance Israel's image in North America, I believe is the exact quote. After 9/11, a few months later, they had changed their name to FDD, and they sort of expanded their prerogative, but they kind of said that they were focusing on security and combating extremism. They kept it, broad enough to really shroud their main interests. And at the time, it was kind of this very bipartisan organization. Their advisors included Newt Gingrich. It included several sort of former FBI and CIA directors, and even Chuck Schumer and Joe Lieberman and Donna Brazile, who were advisors as well. The Democrats over time left as the organization got more partisan, but it's notable that the only reason they left was because it got more partisan, not because they disagreed with the aims. The group also got a lot of money from fan favorites even today, including Bernard Marcus, Paul Singer, Sheldon Adelson, and the like. And so fast forwarding to recently, the Trump administration had been caught I don't want to say caught. I mean, they just kind of did it. They were reusing FDD infographics and even copying and pasting FDD talking points almost word for word to justify this, horrible, disastrous war in Iran. And also, there's this weird revolving door between the Trump administration, the Israeli government, and FDD. So there were several FDD advisors and staffers who previously worked for the Trump White House, including one who is the literal director for supposedly countering Iranian WMDs for the National Security Council. There was another who was Trump's deputy national security advisor. And there was one fellow at the FDD who I want to specifically mention. He was literally Netanyahu's advisor, who led negotiations for the deal to have the U.S. to send Israel $3.8 billion every single year. He also led a committee by his own last name, which advanced the recommendation to develop the Iron Dome. And so I want to reiterate, someone who works for a supposedly American organization was the literal advisor and lead negotiator for a foreign government to take billions of dollars from the American government, who now works alongside people who used to work for the Trump White House also. So that is FDD. And last year, they had published this memo called I believe it was called the United States Israel Strategic Partnership Agreement. So very similar actually to the names that you're seeing in the NDAA amendment process right now. And it was kind of framed as the successor to the current MOU that sends the $3.8 billion to Israel every year. FDD framed this agreement, the U.S. Israel Strategic Partnership Agreement, as mutually beneficial, as this kind of symbiotic path forward that would, have Israel guaranteeing benefits and purchases from the U.S. In terms of weapons and so forth, and that would, create American jobs. It would send Israeli cash flows into the U.S. and also, of course, this agreement would support joint U.S.-Israeli efforts for research, development, and the like. So this was, framed as this revolutionary sort of almost Marshall Plan-esque idea to strengthen the defense base and of course ensure these deep ties between the countries. And this plan did involve still sending aid to Israel with, of course, the promise that Israel would only spend it on American ventures. So that's where you get sort of this idea that it's benefiting the United States. Fast forward a few months, lo and behold, all of a sudden, in the NDAA outcrops these amendments that have very similar names about mutually beneficial ties between the U.S. and Israeli militaries and governments for joint development, joint construction, joint production of strong ties within the countries that will perhaps be successors to the current aid structure. Mm-hmm. I think it's important, you brought this up, Rania, that Netanyahu himself thanked a Republican reportedly for supporting his plan. He called it my plan. There have been some Democrats over the past few months that have pointed to the fact that Netanyahu himself says we have to, end the current aid apparatus that we have as a sort of pathway for them to say the right thing. If you are pointing to Lindsey Graham and Benjamin Netanyahu as support for your way to try to say, yeah, we should change the U.S.-Israel aid relationship, you're a fool. Because it's very clear that they're using that as a wink and nod to be kind of shrewd, to use this moment and to use FDD's blueprint, apparently, as an off-ramp from this massive tanking of U.S. public opinion to have what we have now, which is Netanyahu and Lindsey Graham saying they would actually, I'd like to see an end to the current aid structure to Israel. We don't need the $3.8 billion every year. They're obviously not saying they don't like this vampiristic relationship. They're trying to be clever. They're trying to adapt to political realities and to use this as a sleight of hand while pushing what you're seeing now is this vision to integrate the U.S. and Israeli militaries.
It's actually brilliant in a way, the spin of it. But it's really important that reporters like you are getting ahead of it and explaining it, because these are things that not many people have heard of. And it's so easy to tuck these kinds of provisions into this massive defense authorization bill that gets passed every year because you bury it. There's like a million other measures in there that get debated and thrown in and thrown out. So thank you so much, Prem, for making sure we don't forget about these ones. We will continue following your coverage of this, and I encourage everybody else to. Really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you guys so much. Take care, all right?